United States Penitentiary, Atlanta, Georgia. March 1957. In the oppressive, humid air of a Georgia spring, inside the walls of one of America's most notorious federal prisons, a legendary figure from Harlem's underworld was marking time. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 52 years old, was serving a sentence for narcotics conspiracy. A man who had negotiated with Lucky Luciano, who had ruled a criminal empire with an iron will and a sharp mind, now found himself navigating the brutal hierarchy of the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Johnson had arrived in Atlanta in 1956, transferred from another facility, and had quickly established a reputation that transcended racial lines. He carried himself with a quiet, unshakable dignity, a tailored composure even in prison denims. He was a figure of respect, not just among the black inmates who saw in him a symbol of power and success in a white-dominated world, but also among savvy white convicts who understood the weight of his reputation. He was older than many, not physically imposing at about 5 feet 8 inches, but his presence was a gravitational force. He moved through the prison's grim routines with the calm assurance of a CEO, his sharp eyes missing nothing. But in any prison, especially in the Deep South in the 1950s, respect from reasonable men is only half the battle. The other half is dealing with the unreasonable, the violent, the sadistic, and the racially consumed. And in Atlanta, a man named Arthur Big Art Crenshaw was the embodiment of that unreasoning hate. According to prison records and the accounts of 14 inmates who were incarcerated in Atlanta during the spring of 1957, what happened in the prison dormitory on the night of March 14th became one of the most chilling and effective acts of prison justice in the facility's history. It was not a public cafeteria spectacle like the later Alcatraz legend, but a shadowy, nocturnal operation that carried a far more terrifying message. It was the kind of violence that wasn't witnessed but discovered. It wasn't about public dominance but about a silent, surgical lesson delivered in the dark. And it all started not with a stolen pie or a shove in the shower, but with a single humiliating act of contempt, a glob of spit that landed on a polished shoe. Arthur Big Art Crenshaw, 31 years old in March 1957, was a product of the most virulent racism of the Alabama backcountry. Standing 6 feet 5 inches and weighing nearly 300 pounds of hardened muscle from a life of farm labor and prison yard lifting, Crenshaw was serving a 20-year sentence for a kidnapping and assault so brutal it had made regional newspapers. His victim had been a black shopkeeper. Crenshaw had beaten the man nearly to death with his bare hands before locking him in the trunk of a car, not for ransom but, as he told police, to teach him his place. During his trial, Crenshaw had bragged about his involvement with the Ku Klux Klan and stated that the only regret he had was that the shopkeeper had survived. The prison system had shuffled him through several facilities, each transfer paperwork stamped with warnings: extremely violent, unreconstructed racist, high risk for interracial conflict. Atlanta was supposed to be an endpoint, a place strong enough to contain his poison. Crenshaw viewed the prison not as a punishment, but as a new territory to dominate. He ran with a small group of white supremacists from the southern states, but even they were wary of his unpredictable, seething rage. He was less calculated than the Alcatraz archetype. His hatred was hot, immediate, and physical. He didn't just want to intimidate, he wanted to defile. Big Art didn't play those little mind games, recalled Thomas Red Douglas, a white inmate from Tennessee who served time with him in a 1971 interview. He didn't care about witnesses. His whole thing was to make you feel subhuman. He'd walk up and knock a tray out of a black inmate's hands for no reason. He'd urinate in a shower stall right after a black inmate had used it, staring at him the whole time. It was all about showing utter contempt. And he loved an audience. For Crenshaw, Bumpy Johnson represented everything he despised. Here was a black man who received deference, who other inmates, white and black, approached with a certain cautious respect, who spoke in complete sentences and whose cell was always orderly, whose person was always clean. Crenshaw saw this not as dignity but as an affront. A man he viewed as inferior putting on airs in a world where he believed such men should be cowering. The tension had been building for weeks. Crenshaw would make a point of bumping into Johnson in line, muttering "boy" or "field hand" under his breath. Johnson, following a code honed over decades, would initially ignore it. He was assessing, not avoiding. He was studying Crenshaw's patterns, his alliances, his level of intelligence. He was determining the precise cost of the lesson that would eventually need to be taught. The incident that crossed the irrevocable line occurred on Thursday, March 13, 1957, in the main corridor leading from the machine shop back to the cell blocks. Johnson was walking, flanked by 2 other inmates, his shoes, always meticulously shined with stolen polish, clicking softly on the concrete. Crenshaw, coming the opposite direction with two of his own sycophants, saw his opportunity. As they passed, Crenshaw didn't shove, didn't steal. He stopped, turned his head, and with a forceful, wet tui, spat a large wad of phlegm directly onto the toe of Johnson's right shoe. The sound was obscenely loud in the corridor. He then grinned, showing stained teeth. "Oops," Crenshaw said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Slipped, you better get down and clean that off, boy. That's the nicest thing that's ever been on that shoe." His companions chuckled nervously. Every inmate in that corridor froze. This was beyond theft, beyond a shove. This was a deliberate, primal act of degradation, the kind of insult that in the prison code demanded a violent response or total submission. Johnson stopped. He looked down slowly at the spittle gleaming on his leather shoe. Then, with a motion so calm it was unnerving, he looked up and met Crenshaw's eyes. He didn't glare. He didn't flinch. His expression was one of cold, analytical detachment, as if he were examining a particularly interesting insect. He held the gaze for a full 5 seconds, an eternity in prison, saying absolutely nothing. Then he simply stepped around the spit and the man who delivered it, and continued walking down the corridor, the wet spot on his shoe catching the light. Crenshaw's laughter turned loud and forced, echoing down the hall. "That's right. You know better than to look a white man in the eye. Remember your place." But the victory felt hollow. Johnson's silence was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of a judge who had just passed a sentence, but had not yet announced the punishment. Thomas Douglas recalls the atmosphere that evening. The whole block was buzzing. Crenshaw was strutting around telling everyone how he'd made the Harlem king bow down. But the smarter cons, the ones who'd been around, they weren't so sure. They saw the way Bumpy walked away. There was no shame in it. It was deliberate. Like he'd just finished taking notes. I said to my bunkie, Big Art just signed a check his ass can't cash. He didn't know who he was dealing with. He thought it was about size and screaming. Bumpy Johnson was about geometry and silence. Johnson's reaction, or lack thereof, was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He did not fume in his cell. He did not gather allies for a confrontation. He went about his evening routine with methodical calm. He cleaned the spit from his shoe with a rag, his movements precise and unhurried. Later, in the prison library, he was seen poring over a tattered anatomy book, his finger tracing diagrams. When an anxious younger inmate from Harlem whispered, "Bumpy, we gotta do something about that cracker," Johnson simply looked over his reading glasses and said, "The situation is being assessed. Do not speak of it again." The message was clear. This was not a matter for committee or for gang retaliation. This was a personal transaction, and Johnson would handle the accounting himself. He was not giving Crenshaw rope. He was letting him dig his own grave, one arrogant shovelful at a time. The following day, Friday, March 14th, passed with a tense normality. Crenshaw, emboldened, tried to escalate. During the noon meal, he made a show of walking past Johnson's table and dropping a crust of bread onto his tray. "Here, I know you people like scraps." Johnson did not look up from his plate. He used his fork to push the bread onto the floor and continued eating his stew. The silent dismissal was more infuriating to Crenshaw than any curse. He was being treated as irrelevant, a nuisance to be brushed aside, not a threat to be confronted. This festered in him all afternoon. In the yard he tried to engage, shouting across the concrete, "Hey, shiny shoes! You gonna thank me for my gift?" Johnson was playing chess with an Italian bookie from New York, and merely moved a pawn, never turning his head. By lock-in that evening, Crenshaw was in a volatile state. The humiliation he had tried to inflict had boomeranged. He was the one being humiliated by Johnson's impeccable, unbreakable indifference. He needed to reassert dominance to force a reaction. He decided the next day he would do more than spit. He would take Johnson's food, or he would slap the glasses off his face in front of everyone. He went to sleep in his upper bunk in the large, open dormitory, plotting public violence. He did not know that the private, definitive response was already in motion, and that he would not see the morning with both eyes. The dormitory in Atlanta Penitentiary was a cavernous, grim space filled with rows of double-decker bunks, offering little privacy and amplifying every nocturnal sound, the snores, the coughs, the rustling of sheets. A single night guard patrolled the periphery, making rounds every hour. It was a space of vulnerability, but for a man like Johnson, it was also a space of shadow and opportunity. He had not spent his day idly. The anatomy study had been purposeful. He had also acquired, through the prison's intricate black market, two specific items: a small battery-powered flashlight with a focused beam and a weapon. This was not a slashing shank for public display. This was a tool for precision work, a 6-inch length of hardened, sharpened steel, its tip honed to a vicious point, its handle wrapped tightly in friction tape. It was an ice pick, a stiletto, an instrument for piercing, not cutting. It spoke of a specific anatomical intent. At 2:17 a.m., according to the later estimation of investigators, the night guard passed through the dormitory on his routine round. His flashlight beams swept over the rows of sleeping men. In his bunk, Arthur Crenshaw slept on his back, his mouth open, his massive chest rising and falling. A few bunks away, Ellsworth Johnson appeared to be asleep, facing the wall. The guard moved on, his footsteps fading down the metal staircase. For 10 minutes, there was only the deep, rhythmic sound of collective sleep. Then movement. A figure slipped from a lower bunk with the silence of smoke. He was dressed in dark prison trousers and a dark shirt, his feet bare. In one hand he held the small, focused flashlight. In the other, held low against his thigh, the pointed steel gleamed dully. He did not walk down the central aisle. He moved through the narrow gaps between the bunk ends and the wall, a path he had clearly measured in his mind during the daylight hours. He was a shadow among shadows. In less than 20 seconds, he stood beside the bunk where Arthur Crenshaw slept. What happened next was not a frenzied attack. It was a clinical procedure. The small flashlight clicked on, its beam a tight, blinding circle directed not at Crenshaw's face, but at the pillow just beside his head, providing a stark pool of light over his right eye socket. The left hand came down, not in a punch but in a firm, silencing press over Crenshaw's mouth, pinning his head to the pillow. Crenshaw's eyes flew open, wide with disoriented terror, the pupil of his right eye contracting painfully in the sudden light. He saw a silhouette, a dark shape blotting out the distant ceiling light. He began to struggle, his powerful arms coming up, a guttural sound muffled by the hand. But he was at a catastrophic disadvantage, supine, pinned, disoriented from deep sleep. The right hand holding the steel moved. It did not slash. It did not stab wildly. It descended in a single, controlled, piston-driven thrust. The sharpened point entered the medial corner of Crenshaw's right eye, the tender space between the eye and the bridge of the nose. It penetrated deep into the orbital socket with a wet, crunching sound of fracturing bone and ruptured gel. There was a brief, violent spasm from Crenshaw's body, a kick that rattled the bunk frame, then a terrifying, shuddering rigidity. The hand over his mouth stifled the scream, reducing it to a choked, bubbling whimper that carried no further than the adjacent bunk. The steel was withdrawn. A stream of dark fluid and viscous matter followed it. The flashlight beam held for a second longer, inspecting the result, the collapsed, ruined orbit. Then the light clicked off. The shadow retreated, melting back through the same gaps between the bunks. The entire event, from the placement of the hand to the withdrawal of the tool, lasted less than 8 seconds. The immediate aftermath in the dormitory was a silence more profound than sleep. The choked whimper had been absorbed by the ambient noise of the prison night. The man in the bunk next to Crenshaw, a forger from Mobile named Henry Greer, stirred. "I heard a sound," Greer later told investigators. "Like a wet stick snapping. And then a gurgle like someone trying to drink and breathe at the same time. Then nothing. I figured it was just Art snoring weird. I rolled over and went back to sleep." It wasn't until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the high barred windows at 5:30 a.m. that the horror was discovered. An inmate getting up for the early shift in the laundry passed Crenshaw's bunk. In the dim light, he saw what looked like a dark, glistening stain on the pillow. He leaned closer, then recoiled with a shout that tore the dormitory from its slumber. "Guard! Jesus Christ, guard!" The scene that greeted the arriving guards and the prison medical orderly was one of grotesque, surgical violence. Arthur Crenshaw was alive, but unconscious, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. His face was turned to the side. The right side of his pillowcase was soaked through with a mixture of blood and a clear, gelatinous fluid. His right eye was not simply damaged, it was obliterated. The socket was a concave, pulpy ruin. There was no dramatic slashing wound across the face, no secondary cuts. Just one horrific, penetrating injury, perfectly placed to destroy the organ with maximum efficiency and minimum fuss. The weapon had not been left behind. There was no sign of a struggle beyond the disheveled sheets. It was as if a phantom had visited, delivered a single message of irrevocable ruin, and vanished. It wasn't a fight, the prison doctor would later note in his report, a copy of which was obtained by prison researchers. It was an execution of a specific anatomical function. The attacker knew exactly what he was doing and what he wanted to achieve. This was professional in the most terrifying sense of the word. Chaos erupted, but it was a muted, fearful chaos. Inmates were ordered back to their bunks as guards with shotguns secured the area. Crenshaw was rushed to the prison infirmary on a stretcher, his massive form suddenly looking childlike and broken. Whispers snaked through the rows of bunks like electric current. Every eye at some point flicked toward Bumpy Johnson. He was sitting on the edge of his lower bunk, calmly putting on his socks and shoes. His face was a mask of composed concern, indistinguishable from the shocked expressions around him. When a guard barked, "Johnson, you see or hear anything?" Johnson looked up, his expression one of polite detachment. "I sleep hard, officer. Heard some commotion this morning, that's all. Hope the man is all right." His tone was flat, credible, and utterly impenetrable. He asked no questions. He showed no curiosity. He simply went about the business of preparing for the day, as if the muffled terror of the night had been nothing more than a distant thunderstorm. The prison administration launched an immediate and furious investigation. The warden, a strict disciplinarian named Harold Vicks, was apoplectic. An attack of this severity in a dormitory, under the noses of his guards, was an unforgivable breach of security and a stain on his record. Every inmate in the dorm was interrogated. Cells and personal effects were tossed in frantic, unproductive searches. The weapon was never found. Inmates, when questioned privately, began to weave a tapestry of silence. The black inmates especially had seen Crenshaw spit on Johnson. They understood the economy of the violence. This was not random. This was a receipt being presented. To speak would be to violate a deeper law than the prisons. Even many white inmates, those not aligned with Crenshaw's racist cadre, felt no urge to cooperate. Crenshaw was a brute, a liability, a source of constant tension. His removal in this horrific fashion made the prison marginally safer for everyone. "Nobody saw nothing," became the universal, monotonous refrain. We was all asleep. The only potential witness was Henry Greer, the forger in the next bunk. Under intense pressure, he recounted the wet snap and the gurgle. But when pressed for a description of any figure, any movement, his memory failed. It was dark. I was half asleep. I just figured it was him rolling over. I never saw nobody. Investigators suspected he knew more, but his fear was palpable. Not fear of the guards, but fear of the message sent by the empty eye socket. To point a finger was to risk receiving a similar, nocturnal invoice. The investigation hit a wall. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no credible eyewitnesses. The case file grew thick with speculation and frustration, but devoid of evidence. Warden Vicks knew in his gut who was responsible. The connection between the spitting incident and the blinding was too direct, too poetically brutal to be coincidence. But without proof, without a single inmate willing to break the code of silence, he could do nothing. Johnson, when pulled into the warden's office for a chat, was the picture of respectful innocence. He acknowledged the spitting incident with a dismissive wave. "A disgusting man with disgusting habits, warden. I chose to ignore it. I've been ignored by better men than him." He offered his theory. Perhaps he had enemies among his own kind. Brutal men attract brutal ends. It's a tragedy, but not one I had any part in. His alibi was the same as 60 other men. He was asleep. In the prison infirmary, Arthur Crenshaw's physical and psychological reconstruction began. Surgeons performed an enucleation, removing the destroyed remnants of his eyeball and the shattered pieces of his orbital bone. The socket was cleaned, packed, and sewn shut. He would wear a glass eye eventually, but the damage was profound and permanent. The greater injury, however, was to his psyche. The man who awoke from surgery was not the same man who had gone to sleep. The towering, swaggering bully was gone, replaced by a trembling, withdrawn shell. He would not speak of the attack for days. When he finally did, to a prison psychiatrist, his account was fragmented, terrified. "It was dark. A hand, the light, it was in my eye before I could move. He was so quiet." He was haunted not by the face of his attacker, which he never clearly saw, but by the methodology, the silence, the precision, the absolute control. He had been transformed from a predator into prey, and he understood on a primal level that the hunter was still out there, capable of visiting him again in the deepest sanctum of sleep. He refused to return to the general population. He begged for protective custody, for a transfer, for anything that would remove him from the space where Johnson walked. The legend of what happened began to solidify long before the official investigation closed. It spread not through shouted stories in the yard, but through hushed, urgent whispers in the mess hall line, in the shop, in the library stacks. The details were grim, specific, and carried a moral clarity that resonated through the prison's social strata. A racist had committed the ultimate act of disrespect by spitting on a man of stature. By morning, that racist had lost the eye he had used to look down on his victim. It was biblical in its symmetry, an eye for an eye, but in this case taken, not given. The story emphasized not the public bravado of a cafeteria fight, but the terrifying, private efficiency of the act. The Atlanta job, as some inmates began to call it, was a different kind of lesson. It taught that there were lines which, once crossed, would result not in a brawl you could prepare for, but in a surgical strike you would never see coming. The message was clear: you can spit at me in the light in front of your friends, but I will visit you in the dark, when you are alone and vulnerable, and I will take something from you that you can never get back. Bumpy Johnson's status underwent a seismic shift. Before, he was respected. Now he was revered, and more importantly, he was feared in a way that transcended ordinary prison fear. He was not feared for loud threats or unpredictable rage. He was feared for his preternatural calm, his infinite patience, and the absolute, surgical certainty of his retaliation. White inmates, particularly those with racist leanings, now avoided his gaze entirely. They no longer made snide comments within earshot. The spitting incident was analyzed in hushed tones as the greatest mistake ever made in Atlanta. Crenshaw spit on a king, one inmate later told a chronicler, and the king didn't yell or curse. He just sent his surgeon in the night. Johnson's daily routine became a kind of royal procession. A path cleared for him. Conversations lowered when he passed. Guards, who privately may have held their own prejudices, now treated him with a new, cautious formality. They understood that this man operated on a level they could not control or predict. He had enforced his own justice in their institution, and they had been powerless to stop it or even prove it. In their eyes, that made him the most powerful man in the prison. For the black inmate population, Johnson became an icon of empowered, intelligent resistance. He had not just fought back, he had redefined the terms of engagement. He had taken the most base, humiliating insult and answered it with a response so devastatingly final that it reset the entire prison's racial calculus. Young black inmates looked at him as a professor of survival. "He taught us that power ain't about hollering," said Leroy Barnes, who was 19 in Atlanta in 1957, in a later interview. "It's about stillness. It's about knowing that you can reach out and touch your enemy at the time and place of your choosing, not his. He made us walk taller. Not because we were tough, but because we saw that the toughest man among us was also the quietest and the smartest." The incident also created an unspoken protective shield. 4 months, perhaps years afterward, racist harassment in Atlanta Penitentiary dropped to a notable low. Potential bullies understood that targeting a black inmate might not just mean a fight with that inmate. It might mean attracting the quiet, calculating attention of Bumpy Johnson, a man who settled accounts with terrifying permanence. Johnson himself never spoke of the event. He never boasted, never hinted, never changed his behavior in the slightest. He continued to read, to play chess, to conduct his quiet business dealings within the prison economy. If anything, his demeanor became even more serene. The lesson had been delivered, the balance restored. There was no need for further discussion. His silence on the matter was more powerful than any confession. It reinforced the legend, allowing it to grow in the dark soil of inmate speculation. It confirmed that this was not a crime of passion, but a transaction of justice, closed and finalized. When asked by a trusted associate if he was worried about retaliation from Crenshaw's friends, Johnson merely smiled a thin, humorless smile and said, "Let them worry about me." It was a statement of such chilling confidence that it ended all discussion. The official resolution of the case was an exercise in bureaucratic face-saving. After 6 weeks of fruitless investigation, the file on the assault of Arthur Crenshaw was quietly closed, marked unsolved, no suspects. No disciplinary action was taken against any inmate. The prison administration, unable to prove anything and unwilling to admit their facility could be so thoroughly penetrated, chose the path of quiet containment. Warden Vicks authorized the transfer Crenshaw had begged for. In May of 1957, a broken and terrified Arthur Crenshaw was shipped to the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, with a medical notation detailing his injury and a psychologist's note recommending isolation from general population for his own safety. His departure was a final, unspoken admission of guilt, not his but the prison's. They were transferring the problem, not the solution. Bumpy Johnson remained. The legend, however, did not remain within the walls of Atlanta. It traveled with Crenshaw to Leavenworth, carried in the whispers of transferring guards and inmates. It traveled through the federal prison grapevine, that sophisticated, clandestine communications network that connects populations across the country. By late 1957, inmates in Lewisburg, in Terre Haute, and yes, even on the Rock of Alcatraz, were hearing a new, darkly refined version of the Bumpy Johnson mythology. The Harlem boss wasn't just a man of respect. He was a man of terrifying, nocturnal justice. The story was often told in two parts as a before and after. First, the ultimate insult, the spit on the shoe. Then the ultimate reply, the silent removal of an eye in the dead of night. It was a parable about consequence, a stark warning that some men carry a price list for disrespect, and the currency is anatomical. This growing legend fundamentally shaped Johnson's reception when he himself was transferred to Alcatraz in 1958. He did not arrive as an unknown quantity. He arrived as a myth. Inmates and guards alike had heard the Atlanta story. They watched him, this neatly dressed older man with the calm eyes, and they wondered. This pre-existing reputation is a crucial, often overlooked backdrop to the later, more famous Alcatraz confrontation with Poulson. When Eric Poulson began his campaign of harassment against Johnson in 1959, he was not testing an untried man. He was challenging a legend whose climax he had not personally heard. But others had. They watched Johnson's patient tolerance of Poulson's thefts and shoves with a sense of dreadful anticipation. They weren't wondering if Johnson would respond, but how and when. The Atlanta story provided the template, the strategic patience the escalation allowed, and then the swift, permanent correction. In a very real sense, the silent horror of the Atlanta dormitory made the public violence of the Alcatraz cafeteria inevitable. Poulson was walking a path Crenshaw had already blazed toward a similar, though publicly different, abyss. The contrast between the two incidents is what cements Johnson's unique legacy in prison lore. Atlanta was private, silent, and surgical. Alcatraz was public, explosive, and declarative. Together, they presented a complete portfolio of controlled violence. They proved Johnson was adaptable, a master of context. In Atlanta, where witnesses were a liability, he worked in perfect shadows. In Alcatraz, where a public statement was needed to reset the social order for a community, he worked in brutal, blinding light. He could be a ghost or a thunderclap, depending on what the situation demanded. This duality made him utterly unpredictable to his enemies and gave his reputation a depth that no single act could achieve. Inmates understood, you might survive a public fight with Bumpy Johnson. You would not survive a private reckoning. The fate of Arthur Big Art Crenshaw was a postscript of pathetic decline. At Leavenworth, his reputation preceded him, but not as a feared racist enforcer. He was known as One-Eye Art, the man who had spit on Bumpy Johnson. He was a living cautionary tale, a walking monument to a single, catastrophic error in judgment. The bravado was gone, replaced by a skittish paranoia. He avoided conflict, especially with black inmates, and spent most of his time in protective custody or in low-risk prison jobs. The giant had been shrunk, not just physically disfigured, but psychologically neutered. He served his full 20-year sentence, a model of passive compliance, and was released in 1973. He returned to Alabama, but to a different South than the one he had left. He lived a reclusive, impoverished life, working as a night watchman, a fitting irony for a man forever haunted by the dark. He died in 1989, his obituary a single line in a local paper. Former inmates who heard of his death reflected that the man who died was not the one who had entered prison. Bumpy Johnson had killed the essential part of Arthur Crenshaw long before his heart finally stopped. He had taken his sense of invincibility, his identity as a predator, and left only the hollow, frightened shell. The psychological mastery displayed by Bumpy Johnson in the Atlanta incident warrants deep examination. This was not mere revenge. It was a complex, multi-layered act of psychological warfare designed to achieve maximum strategic effect with minimal physical risk to himself. The first layer was the cultivation of an impenetrable facade. By not reacting to the spit, by treating it with the detached disgust one shows a puddle on the street, Johnson denied Crenshaw the satisfaction of a reaction. He refused to play the role of the angry, emasculated victim that Crenshaw's racism required. This created a cognitive dissonance in his attacker, seeding frustration and leading to the careless, public escalation that made Crenshaw the obvious and only suspect in the eyes of the prison community when retribution came. The second layer was the method of the retaliation itself. A public beating, even a severe one, would have been understandable within the prison's economy of violence. It would have been a transaction, after which the score could theoretically be settled. But the removal of an eye in the silent darkness was something else entirely. It was symbolic, targeting the very organ Crenshaw had used to look upon Johnson with contempt. It was also profoundly intimate and terrifying. It conveyed a message of absolute vulnerability. I can reach you when you are most defenseless. I can take a part of you permanently and you will never see me coming. This kind of violence doesn't just punish an act. It annihilates a man's sense of security for the rest of his life. It transforms the world into a place where every shadow might hold a surgeon of vengeance. The third and perhaps most brilliant layer was the aftermath. Johnson's serene, unbreakable silence following the attack was a continuous, passive aggression. It forced the entire prison, including the administration, to participate in his narrative. By never speaking of it, he allowed the legend to grow unimpeded by fact or contradiction. His calm demeanor screamed his guilt louder than any confession, while simultaneously providing him with perfect plausible deniability. He weaponized the human tendency to fear the unknown and the unspoken. Every guard and inmate was left to imagine the planning, the stealth, the cold-blooded precision required, and those imagined details were always more frightening than reality. He made himself not just a man but a force of nature, a predictable principle, cross me and suffer, embodied in an unpredictable form you will never know how or when. This incident also reveals the stark racial and geographical context of the American prison system in the 1950s. Atlanta Penitentiary was in the heart of the Jim Crow South. The guards were predominantly white Southerners. The social order of the outside world heavily influenced the dynamics inside. A black man asserting dominance, particularly over a white inmate who embodied the old racial hierarchy, was a transgression of immense social magnitude. Johnson's action was therefore not just personal defense. It was a political act. It was a decapitation strike against the local embodiment of white supremacist terror. By making an example of Crenshaw, he didn't just protect himself. He effectively declared that within these walls, a different set of rules applied. Rules governed by intelligence, nerve and consequence, not by the color of one's skin. He created, through terror, a pocket of extraordinary equality. For black inmates, this was a revolutionary act. It demonstrated that the oppressive power structure could be subverted and dominated from within, not through petition or protest, but through superior strategy and the will to enact terrifying justice. Furthermore, the Atlanta story exposes the complicity and limitations of the prison authority. The guards undoubtedly knew of Crenshaw's behavior. Their failure to curb his harassment of black inmates, particularly a high-profile inmate like Johnson, was a form of tacit approval, or at the very least, a calculated indifference. Johnson's unilateral action was a direct result of this institutional failure. He became the judge, jury, and executioner precisely because the official systems of justice and protection within the prison were absent or biased. The administration's ultimate response, closing the case and transferring the victim, was an admission of this failure. They could not control Johnson, and they could not protect Crenshaw from the consequences of a system they had allowed to fester. In the end, Johnson proved to be the most effective and most feared authority in the cell block. He established a deterrence that their rulebooks and shotguns could not. The tools of Johnson's trade in this instance were also significant. The sharpened steel pick was not a weapon of blind rage, it was a tool of a specific trade. Its use implied knowledge, forethought, and access to a network capable of producing such an item. The small flashlight indicated planning for sensory control, to blind and disorient as much as to illuminate. This was not a weapon grabbed in a moment of passion. This was a mission-specific kit assembled by a professional. This aspect of the story fed into his legend as a master criminal, a man whose skill set translated seamlessly from running a numbers racket in Harlem to conducting covert operations in a prison dormitory. It reinforced the idea that he was operating on a different intellectual plane than the common convict, who might settle for a crude shank or a sock full of batteries. Johnson brought a craftsman's approach to violence. The long-term reverberations of the Atlanta incident within the broader tapestry of American prison culture cannot be overstated. While the Alcatraz story became the more popular action-oriented legend, the Atlanta story was the foundational myth, the dark scripture whispered by those who understood the deeper, more terrifying layers of power. It became a cornerstone of what inmates call the silent code, the understanding that true power often speaks in whispers and acts in shadows. The story was a master text on several key principles of convict survival: the power of patience, the strategic value of invisibility, the importance of making any retaliation so disproportionate and terrifying that it deters future challenges for years to come. For decades afterward, in prisons across the country, the story was invoked as the ultimate reference point in disputes. A seasoned convict counseling a hot-headed younger inmate might say, "You want to go at him like that? Remember what happened in Atlanta. You win a fight today, you might lose an eye tomorrow. Some men don't fight back right away. They wait and they remember." It taught a generation of inmates that the most dangerous man in any yard is not the one shouting threats, but the one who absorbs an insult, meets your gaze with a calm, unreadable expression, and then walks away without a word. That walk, after the Atlanta story entered lore, was loaded with new meaning. It was no longer necessarily a sign of weakness. It could very well be the first step in a silent, meticulous countdown to ruin. The story also fundamentally altered the way racist inmates, particularly in federal facilities, calculated risk. Overt, humiliating harassment of respected black inmates became a far riskier proposition. It introduced a chilling variable, the possibility of a response that was not a straightforward fight, but a meticulously planned mutilation. The fear was not of getting beaten but of being marked, permanently and symbolically, as a lesson for others. This acted as a significant deterrent. The calculus shifted from, "Is this black inmate tough enough to fight me?" to "Is he connected, smart or ruthless enough to have me Atlanta ed?" This protective shadow extended, by association, to other black inmates, as potential aggressors could never be sure who might have the ear or the respect of a man like Johnson. Within the pantheon of criminal folklore, Bumpy Johnson's legend is unique because it is equally rooted in his intellect and his capacity for violence. Other legends, a John Dillinger, a Pretty Boy Floyd, are based on bravado, bank robberies and clashes with police. Johnson's defining legends are interpersonal, psychological, and deeply embedded in the closed society of the prison. They are about social control, respect, and the maintenance of personal sovereignty in the most oppressive environment imaginable. The Atlanta incident showcases the cerebral aspect of this legend in its purest form. It was a chess move played in 3 dimensions, with human psychology as the board and a man's eye as the taken piece. It proved that his greatest weapon was not a shank, but his mind. His ability to plan, to manipulate perceptions, and to enforce his will with terrifying finality without ever raising his voice. Johnson's own perspective on the incident, though never formally recorded, can be inferred from his consistent philosophy. He viewed the world, both inside and outside prison, through the lens of a pragmatic businessman. Respect was currency. Order was necessary for business. An insult like Crenshaw's was not just a personal slight. It was a devaluation of his currency and a threat to the orderly system he navigated. The response, therefore, could not be an emotional outburst. It had to be a calculated revaluation, a shocking, market-correcting action that would restore his capital and deter future devaluation. In this light, the blinding was not sadism, it was severe monetary policy. It was about sending a signal to the entire market, the prison population, that the currency of his respect was backed by the most severe of reserves. This cold, transactional view explains his lack of remorse and his serene demeanor afterward. The books had been balanced. The ledger was closed. The story's endurance is also a testament to its narrative perfection. It has a classic 3-act structure: the blatant, humiliating provocation, the spit; the tense, quiet period of anticipation, Johnson's silent planning; and the shocking, irreversible climax, the nocturnal blinding. It features a clear villain, a stoic hero, and a poetic, brutal justice. It operates on a symbolic level that resonates across cultures, the defiler being defiled in the most intimate way. It is a dark fable about pride, consequence, and the hidden cost of disrespect. This narrative strength ensured its survival through oral tradition, passed from inmate to inmate, prison to prison, long after the specific names and dates might have faded. It became less about Bumpy Johnson and Art Crenshaw in Atlanta in 1957, and more about the man who spat and lost his eye, an archetypal warning story. The juxtaposition of the Atlanta and Alcatraz incidents presents a fascinating study in the evolution of Johnson's tactics and the differing demands of each prison environment. Atlanta was a sprawling, old-world southern prison with large, open dormitories and a culture steeped in the region's overt racial hierarchies. In that context, a silent, private, and symbolically intimate act of vengeance was the most potent weapon. It used the very architecture of the prison, the dark, crowded dorm, and the social blind spot of the guards to its advantage. The message was meant to seep into the consciousness of the population slowly, through horrified discovery and hushed rumor, fundamentally altering the psychological landscape. Alcatraz, by contrast, was a modernist cage of concrete and steel, a last resort, prison on a cold island where every action was under intense surveillance and where the inmate population was a collection of the most notorious and recalcitrant felons in America. In such an environment, a private message could be lost or misunderstood. The social order was more fragmented, the threats more diverse. Here, Johnson required a public demonstration. The cafeteria attack on Pol Sun was a piece of theater, a brutal performance art piece delivered in the most watched space in the prison. It was designed for immediate, overwhelming impact, to reset the social order in a single bloody instant. The message was not subtle. This is what happens here and now in the light for all to see. Where Atlanta was a stealth bomber, Alcatraz was a tactical nuke. Both achieved total dominance, but through methods perfectly calibrated to their respective ecosystems. This adaptability is the hallmark of Johnson's genius. He was not a prisoner of a single style or reputation. He was a tactician who understood that power is contextual. His legend is not monolithic. It is dualistic, which makes it more profound and more intimidating. It told the prison world, "You cannot predict my response. You cannot assume you are safe in a crowd or safe in your bunk. I will choose the time, the place, and the method that most efficiently ends your threat." This duality made him an enigma wrapped in a reputation, a problem that could not be solved by conventional prison politics or violence. The legacy of the Atlanta incident also intersected with the emerging civil rights movement in a complex, underground way. While leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were advocating for nonviolent resistance and integration in the world outside, inside the prisons, a different, stark reality prevailed. There was no moral authority to appeal to, no sympathetic media. The law was often administered with a club and a sneer. In this world, Johnson's actions were seen by many black inmates as a form of raw, necessary justice, the only kind available. It was not the justice of the courtroom, but the justice of the jungle, executed with a chess master's precision. He became a dark folk hero, a symbol of the idea that if the system will not protect you, and in fact is often the source of your oppression, you must cultivate the capacity to protect yourself with utter finality. His story validated a desperate, interior form of empowerment for men who had been stripped of all agency. It was a brutal, unsanitized counterpart to the broader movement for dignity, a reminder that before there could be a dream, there often had to be a demonstrated willingness to make nightmares for those who would deny that dream. In the final analysis, the 1957 Atlanta incident stands as the purest expression of Bumpy Johnson's operational philosophy. It removed all superfluous elements, the audience, the dialogue, the secondary conflicts. It distilled his approach down to its essence: a grievous provocation, a period of silent, lethal calculation, and a response that was both personally catastrophic for the offender and communicatively perfect for the intended audience. It was violence as a precise language, spoken in a single, unforgettable syllable. While the Alcatraz story is more cinematic and thus more frequently told, those who know the deeper lore understand that Atlanta is where the true measure of the man was taken. It was there he proved that his most formidable prison was not made of bars and concrete, but the one he built in the minds of his enemies, a prison of fear, uncertainty, and the certain knowledge that a debt of disrespect would be collected, with interest, in the darkest hour of the night. Bumpy Johnson was released from the Atlanta Penitentiary in 1958, only to be transferred immediately to Alcatraz, where his legend would be cemented in a new, public fashion. He served his time on the Rock, was released in 1963 and returned to Harlem, where he died of a heart attack in 1968. But the story of what he did to Arthur Crenshaw in the Atlanta dormitory in March of 1957 never died. It lived on in the oral histories of the American penal system, a ghost story told with reverence and fear. It became part of the foundational curriculum of convict survival, a case study in the economics of respect and the high cost of its theft. The story's power lies in its demonstration of a terrifying, logical principle. In a world governed by brute force, the ultimate victory belongs not to the strongest brute, but to the most intelligent strategist who is willing to wield brutality as a tool. Johnson understood that to change a man's behavior, you must change his understanding of reality. Crenshaw's reality was that his size and racism made him untouchable. Johnson rewrote that reality with 6 inches of sharpened steel. He didn't just punish an act, he dismantled a worldview. Crenshaw didn't just lose an eye, he lost the foundational myth of his own superiority. He was forced to live the rest of his days in a world where a black man he had spit upon had proven himself, definitively and irrevocably, to be the more powerful entity. That is a psychological death sentence. The Atlanta job remains the darker, sharper counterpart to the Alcatraz show. Together, they form the complete legend of Bumpy Johnson, The Prince of Harlem, who was also the undisputed king of any prison yard he walked. They answer different questions. Alcatraz answers, what happens if you publicly challenge him? Atlanta answers the more chilling question, what happens if you truly disrespect him? The first is a spectacle of public justice. The second is an intimate masterpiece of private vengeance. One was about sending a message to a community. The other was about etching a lesson directly onto a man's soul, one thrust at a time. In the annals of true crime and prison lore, tales of violence are commonplace. But tales of violence this calculated, this patient, and this symbolically perfect are rare. They transcend mere brutality and enter the realm of dark art. Johnson was not a mindless killer. He was a consummate professional whose medium was consequence. The Atlanta incident is his most refined work. It is why, decades later, the story is still told not just as a historical anecdote, but as a parable. It warns that in the human jungle, there are predators who do not roar. They observe from the shadows, calculate with cold intellect, and strike not to injure, but to redefine the very nature of the game. Arthur Crenshaw learned this the hard way, paying for a moment of hateful contempt with a lifetime of sight in only one eye, and a soul perpetually braced for a darkness that had already come and gone. That was March 14, 1957. That was the night a racist prisoner spat on Bumpy Johnson's shoe and made the last, worst mistake of his life. By morning, he had learned the final price of that spit, measured not in apologies or fistfights, but in fluid ounces of vitreous humor and shattered bone. He learned that the quiet man from Harlem did not get mad. He did not get even. He got permanent. And in the grim economy of the prison, where respect is the only currency that never inflates, Bumpy Johnson's balance after that night was forever unquestioned.